Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the June 2023 edition of the St. Louis Java Users Group. So for those who don't know, the St. Louis Java Users Group is an informal group. Attendance is free. We don't maintain a formal membership list. We normally meet on the second Thursday of every month except December when there's no meeting. There's just too many things going on over the holidays for us to be able to schedule a meeting in December. When we meet in person, you can join us for food and social at 6 p.m. and the presentation and meeting will start at 6:30 p.m. But unfortunately, we haven't figured out a way to send the food over the internet, so we just start the meeting at our normal meeting time at 6:30. When we do meet in person, we meet in the Object Computing Incorporated training room, and that's at 12,140 Woodcrest Executive Drive, Suite 310, and that is in St. Louis, Missouri. I'd like to introduce the other members of the St. Louis Java Users Group Steering Committee. So from left to right, we have Ted Doyle, Todd Zimmerman, Bruce Allspaw, that's me in the middle, Wei-Chi Gao, and Kathy Zwang. You can reach all of us on the steering committee if you send an email to that address that's at the bottom of your screen. That's javasigsc@ociweb.com, and we'll all get that. We'll all get that email. I'd also like to introduce the newest member of our steering committee, and that's Robert Levitt. So welcome aboard, Robert. The St. Louis Java Users Group would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So I have their logos here, so I'll just work my way across left to right, top to bottom. Object Computing Incorporated is our original founding sponsor. Object Computing Incorporated has been with us since the JUG was founded back in 1997. Yes, we've been going all the way since 1997. And they've been filling us in whenever we have gaps and things. And so they've just been a great sponsor here all the way. JFrog is also another important sponsor. They cover the subscription fees for the Meetup website. It's free for you to be able to use the Meetup website and to find all the meeting announcements and everything there. But it does cost the JUG some money to have the St. Louis Java Users Group listed on the site. They cover that cost. They also cover the Zoom subscription, which enables us to be able to have these online meetings. So thank you to JFrog. Signature Consultants and Adaptive Solutions Group are both headhunters. And when we meet in person, they often will sponsor the food. So if you are looking for a job, or if you have a job that you would like to fill, like a Java job, just do a quick Google search for Signature Consultants or Adaptive Solutions Group and let them know that you found out about them through the St. Louis Java Users Group. At the end of this meeting, we will be raffling 2 JetBrains licenses for any JetBrains product of your choice. So thank you to JetBrains for allowing us to do that raffle. That will be at the end of the meeting. Now, if you're watching the recording, though, I'm sorry, you're too late. You do have to be present in the actual live meeting to be able to participate in the raffle at the end. So must be present to win on those 2 JetBrains licenses subscriptions that we'll raffle at the end of the meeting. Elastic will also sponsor some gift cards, and we'll do those when we're back in person. Intertech is a training company, and they have lots of training videos on the Intertech website, and they sponsor the famous Screaming Flying Monkeys. What? Screaming Flying Monkeys? Those are little dolls, and if you throw them up against the wall, they make a little screaming sound, and they're a lot of fun. But they also sponsor coffee cups, mouse pads, and so forth. So thank you to Intertech. At the end of this meeting, we will also be raffling 2 Manning ebooks of your choice. And again, that's at the raffle at the end of the meeting, and you must be present to win. Sorry if you're watching the recording, you can't do that. You must be present. Okay. Pearson also will sponsor physical books as well. So thank you to Pearson for your support. And indeed, thank you to all of the Jug sponsors for your support. So just a shout out, thank you. Here's some announcements. The Kansas City Java Users Group, that's kind of our sister Jug over in Kansas City on the other side of the state. They are having their KCDC conference. And that's this month, June 21st through the 23rd. And you can get information about that if you visit their website there on the screen. That's kcdc.info for Kansas City Developer Conference. Later this fall, we will have a conference in St. Louis, and that's the Strange Loop 2023 conference. And that will be at the St. Louis Union Station, September 21st through the 22nd of this year. And you can get the information on that if you go to their website, thestrangeloop.com. So you might want to visit those websites for some announcements and to find out about those conferences as well. So if you want to keep up with our presentation schedule, that's easy. Just go to our meetup site. That's meetup.com/gatewayjug. And as soon as we get things scheduled, we update the presentation schedule there. And as soon as it's there, you can go ahead and RSVP for the meeting so that you get your reminders about the meeting and as far as when it starts. If you are interested in giving a presentation or becoming a Jug sponsor, or if you're interested in serving on the steering committee, or you have ideas for presentations or anything like that, you can just email all of us on the steering committee. If you just send an email again to that same email address before, that's javasigsc@ociweb.com. So those are all of my announcements. Tonight's presentation is on Flyway and Java, Change, Build, Deploy. And that's by Barry Attwater of Redgate. So Barry has been very good. It's after midnight over there. So he has very patiently stayed up to be able to give this presentation. So I'm going to cut you a little bit of a break because I know it's late for you. So I'm going to click the stop share button, and that will allow you, Barry, to share your screen, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me here today. Yes, as Bruce alluded to, it's gone midnight here. I'm about over 4,000 miles away in England at the moment, so thank you very much for having me. Yes, I wanted to talk to you guys today about Flyway and about Java and the integration between Flyway into your Java products. Today's talk will be going through what is Flyway and what it can do, the problems that it's trying to solve, as well as other functionality of it, which might be of interest to yourselves. The main crux of this will be about the relationship between your Java applications and the databases that they may rely on. As we code and develop, we sometimes end up with these situations where we have our databases that we need to change as we go along. These changes can either be done manually yourselves, or they might have to go through someone else, a higher power, a database admin or whatever, depending on your structures, whether or not this is something you're doing yourself, something you're doing in a corporate setting, or something that is somewhere in between. But I'll be specifically talking about Flyway as a tool, as well as the methodologies, but specifically as Flyway as a tool. To begin with, something about myself as well, when it comes to sort of the things I like to discuss, I like a good tool. So I like specifically talking about good tools. So Flyway is my things we'll be talking about today. And we're all aware of some of the problems when it comes to tools in our development. It's always the old proverb of a bad workman blames his tools when things go wrong, and that when you have the wrong tools, let's say the old normally miscontributed quote of if the only tool you have is a hammer and it's tempted to treat everything like nails, the wrong tools can create the wrong situations. Hopefully this will be a tool that you'll find interesting and be able to understand the right approaches with this and the way that it can be used, as well as the appropriate ways, the appropriate places for it to be used as well. So what might you be facing when developing with, specifically with Java, Java distributables and your databases? You might be lucky. You might have one service or one command line application that connects to a single database, in which case it's a pretty easy relationship. You've got your application, you've got your database, and you talk between the two. You might not have control of that database. You might do, you might not. Those are the problems that you might end up facing. You also might be in situations where you have multiple services talking to the same database or database instance, because you're trying to, because you need to, because they're load balanced, or because of infrastructure reasons, you can only have one database, or in situations like MySQL, for example, where the concept of the difference between schema and database is not very much, so you tend to have one database instance with multiple databases on it, treated as way. Or you have services that connect to multiple databases, either because they need different sections data, or because there's backups and readme only versions and things like that. All these things need to be in sync with each other. You can't have a service that is relying on, it's calling columns and tables in a database that it doesn't know exists, and vice versa. If there's been changes to the database, the service needs to understand. So it is that symbiotic relationship between the two when you're developing. Code updates, database updates need to sort of be in sync, and those problems going on. Now, there's certain aspects of that might be, if it was a stable, finished product, don't have to worry about it, it's going to stay stable, it's going to be on a thing. But most of the time you're tinkering or you're developing, depending on your situation. You might be continuing to develop a piece of software ongoing, or it's a project of your own and you just like to keep tinkering with it. So when your service is ongoing development, nothing's going to stay stable or stay in set in stone. You're going to have update cycles. If you're deploying this elsewhere to people or to yourselves, you are going to potentially end up with cycles of updates in different environments, depending on your development, that might not be consistent. So you need to make sure that all of those things become in sync. And data integrity, when you talk about databases and with your services, is always important. You can't, if you've got something that's had a wealth of information in your database, you don't want to lose that when you're trying to make changes. So what can we use for that? Now, JavaSphere and Java services, there's always a bunch of tools that, there's some consistent tools that people go to when it comes to writing connections between their database and their software. You might be using Spring, and therefore with Spring and JPA, or you might be getting onto Hibernate and using Hibernate to make your data models and everything, or you might just be using pure JPA. Those are great tools when it comes to modeling your data within your services, but it's then that connection of how you get those changes into your database. And somebody still do a basic job of that. All three of these that I'm giving examples here all have a create and import and static data methods and things like that, but they're limited. They're usually best at creating rather than keeping updating as you go. So what might you be wanting to do? You might want to create and alter your database entities, as mentioned before, because you've made changes, you understand you want to make an improvement or something like that. You might have multiple schemas you want to be talking to differently. You might have a separation between your areas of data. So you might have security concerns. That means you need to keep things in different schemas. You can't have tables full of user data interacting with a schema full of product data, for example, or stuff like that. And you might be wanting to manipulate static data as you go along as well. So with all that in mind, what am I talking about today? So Flyway is a tool I'm going to be talking about. Flyway is a system or a library specifically. It's open source. It has got a corporate side to it as well, but I'll be talking about the open source version of it, which has got integrations with your Java applications. It's a Java application itself. It's available on Maven. You can import it into your product. You can distribute it within your systems, and it is its responsibility to manage your database versioning, so your updates to your database as you develop. What might this look like? So what kind of things you might be wanting to do? So you have a database. In this case, I'm giving an example in a very crude model of this is a veterinary surgery, you'll have a list of types of animals your veterinary take. You have customers who have pets you only register. You have your vets and your appointments. As I say, this is a very basic model. I'm not trying to do anything too sophisticated with this example. To be totally honest, this is taken from inspiration of the Swagger API examples, which is a pet shop. So you can maybe see where my mind was going when I wrote this. So you've got the basic idea. You have, I say, all the models I talked before, but you've got animals and you have the type of animal it is, like a dog or a cat, etc., etc. But you also might have classifications as well, like mammals or reptiles or birds. So you can make sure that you assign them correctly as you go along. And you're going to have duplicates of this. So you maybe think that, oh, actually, a couple of months down the line, you'll be making this system or whatever. You might end up going, oh, this is a lot of duplicate data inside the database. You might separate it off. So you create a classification table and you update it. This is all talking about what you would be doing within your services, your models, your creation, and how you then have to get that into your database as changes. Because you can't just say create. When you create table and that, you need to make sure that if you've gone from a version of your data of your service to a new version of your service in an environment that already has this database and everything linked up, that you can do that migration of changing from one to the other without having conflicts and having to do drop tables and things like that. This is just example of Java code. I'm using JPA to show my models. This is the kind of changes that I was making a comment on before. So you can see here, this is my basic model. I've got ID, type, and classification, as I showed them here before, and then I'm changing to having a one-to-many relationship and thing. That's my code. I'm Java. I've written my code. Cool. What do I need to do then once I do get this version and start releasing this version? Do I need to do to get the database changes into my environment? So as you see from here, talking about different versions. So you've got version 1, which is the original version. You've got version 2, maybe went out, didn't have any changes, just was updates. Version 3 is where we made that change to include the classification. And version 4, just to say there's version 4 that came in afterwards that had changes, but not database changes. This is what I'm representing by these scripts down here. This didn't have a script, this didn't have a script, but these did. So version 1 went out with an update to run, whether or not that was done automatically or as part of a manual process for doing release. That set up your basic database, and then this was an update to say, oh, we need to change all these things inside the database. It's great if you can do every single version, you're doing every single release, but then you can have problems. If you have an inconsistent release process or inconsistent receiver of your service, you might end up being in situations where they took version 1, took version 2, but version 3 didn't get taken for some reason. Maybe you found a bug in it before it was deployed and you pulled it, or maybe they just didn't take it that month or that week. So you get to version 4, which is expecting this classification table, but since the update scripts haven't gone out with it, it doesn't happen, and then you get a failure. Same thing with people who don't. You're doing a weekly release and somebody takes a monthly release, you've got all these things in the middle that weren't taken. So how can Flyway solve that? Flyway works on the idea of having migration scripts and versioning for your database. What that means in this case is that every version that you release has a series of version scripts, as you can see within this table, that will be applied to your database when your system deploys, depending on how you configured it, to update to a particular state. Now, if the databases will have this storage of the versioning, if it knows it has run that script, it just won't run it. But if it notices that there's any other new scripts in there that hasn't run, it will run those in case. So you can see the table I've got here. I've got a series of ones which you can see from the state. Just to go over this table, this is a Flyway info table. I prettied it up for this demonstration, but this will come out on console. You have your category of what type of script you're running. So you can see here I've got versions and repeatables. I'll go into a bit of a definition about the difference between those shortly. You've got the version numbers. Now these can be an incremental number or it can be something else. I personally prefer a timestamp approach. I'll explain a bit more about what that means later. Basic description, what type of script it is, and in case this is all SQL, and when they were installed on. So what you're seeing here, and what I'll show in a demonstration in a minute, is that all these ones here that have got success were my version 1. This is what built up the original version database from my original version 1. Version 2 came along, there wasn't any additions. Version 3 came along, and version 3 included this additional script down the bottom. Now, this is before anything's been ran, and it's showing that Flyway has identified the script, but not deployed it because it hasn't run its migration yet. This is just an identification process. After that, it deploy those scripts and update it once version 3 is deployed, and it will know in its history that those are what's been. So if you redeploy version 3 or any other version, Flyway would check your database and see that it's done its job and doesn't need to do anything again. So you can reduce that risk of having missed a version, or have to or that problem of going over your redeploying things that you've already redeployed and creating duplicates, especially when you talk about static data. So you can see in here the previous example, the previous setup I described. So you have updates for each version. You can see here that this was version 1 with your original scripts. Going into version 2, Flyway knows that those scripts were already deployed and doesn't need to be done again. Version 3 comes along, it has an additional script. So it knows those original ones have been deployed, doesn't need to do those again, but will deploy that new script. And version 4 comes along and deploys, doesn't deploy anything because it knows that original ones were deployed and the additional one that was introduced in version 3 was deployed. And this is the result of after that version 3 has been deployed. You can see now that that final one has all become a success. And given the previous examples of missing out on version releases, you see here version 1 deploys all these ones. Version 2, yep, those are all fine. Version 3 got missed. Version 4 comes along, and before it starts up, you see, yes, no, these original ones were deployed, but this new one wasn't, so I'm going to have to deploy it. So, wrong way. And the same thing if you're doing the whole skipping out and doing a monthly release, you can went from version 1 to version 4. Version 1 would do its deployment, version 4 would deploy anything that wasn't included. So what does this look like in practice? Flyway, as I say, is a Java application. Now there's multiple ways where you can include this in a product in your system. I'm going to show the two ways of doing. I'm going to show multiple ways of doing this. At the moment, I'm just showing this as code, but I'll open up my IDE in a minute and step through this. But basically, you have Flyway as an object in your system, and when you start the application up, if you want to, or whenever you feel appropriate, you call it to run its stages and its configuration. And so this is just a basic example of how you can introduce this into your system. I'll go into more depth when I get my IDE up to show you more of a demonstration. You can see here that I've got Flyway configuration. I'm setting a data source, which will be your database connection details. I'm setting a location for the migration scripts that I will be running and loading that into being a Flyway object. I can then call info, which is to get information about the state of my database. Depends on what, that's less important when you're trying to do continuous deployment, but for demonstrations like this, it's quite important, and migrate as well. So you can then go forward with the migration of your database. So let me just open up my IDE and I can begin to show you. Just give me 2 seconds, sorry. Unfortunately, I left my demonstration in a rather poor state. Give me a second. So my IDE in a poor state. So I've got three different versions of how we can integrate Flyway into a Java project here. So I will be going through each one as I talk about this. So these are all very basic. These aren't complicated systems. I'm trying to keep them as simple as possible, just to show the pure how you would do Flyway with Java, and then show about the benefits that go through it. So in this case, this is simply, it's a basic Java application with a main and nothing much else. but this starts going into talking about what we're doing. So I'm using SQLite for this just so I can have a file database to make this simpler. You can use any, there's a list on the Flyway website of all the supported databases. That list is ever increasing, so I would take a look at that rather than list them off here now. But yeah, as I say, I'm using SQLite just so I can use a file database rather than having to spin up my own for convenience sake, and to deter the wrath of the demo curses of services not working. You want them to. Anyway, this is quick demonstration. This is a quick explanation. So have your SQL, you have your JDBC URL. Flyway is, Flyway is a Java application. It's mostly based around JDBC connections. So you'll be using a JDBC connection string to be able to connect to your database. So those are important things to note when you're doing this. So we've got your JDBC setting up, which I've got a setup method here, which is creating my Flyway instance, which I showed in the slide. But here is the utility class. Because it's a SQLite, I don't need a username and password, so those were set to null, because I just don't need them for this. But if you did do this on a SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, any of those type of databases that do have more stringent security, you can set those values. As well as script locations, I'm using a unified script location. You can see my scripts, my version scripts here. There is some defaults. So if you're doing this as a distributed system, by default, the scripts can live inside your jar. They don't have to be external properties. They can exist inside your jar, and they'll be loaded by Flyway through the resource loader. Because these are demonstrations, I'm using external scripts just so I can keep one set of scripts for each of these demonstrations. You have the ability to have that customization, as well as being able to add more complicated config files if you decide to go down that approach. I'm doing this all through Java. There's a lot more options that you can pick with this than what I'm able to show in this time, but there's multiple ways you can do this. So I've got the Flyway, setting up my configuration, my data source, my locations, which is pointing to this folder here. I've got clean disabled for demonstration purposes. So Flyway, as well as being able to create your database, is able to tear it down as well through a clean process. That's not always desired, and for security reasons, by default, that's off. I've got that on for these demonstrations, so I can do some quick changing around if necessary when questions arise. Furthermore, you can see that the two methods I mentioned before exist. So yeah, I'm just running Flyway straight, and I'm then making a query call to a table within the structure that I'm creating, and just producing information just to show that this is what's going on and the launching that's going through this. And these scripts are simply just MySQL scripts. One of the benefits of being able to use Flyway is that everything is native scripts. So if you know how to do it on the database, you can do it within a Flyway script. You don't have to learn any DSLs or anything like that some of the other systems need you to learn. So realistically, when you're doing this, you need to know Java and your database language, and that's it. There are other types of migration scripts that you can run with this. Flyway supports scripting languages that are native to your environment. So if you're using a Linux machine, you can use Bash, or you can use PowerShell if you're a Windows user, or you can use Python if you've got that installed in your environment. But you can also write Java migrations as well, doing JDBC connections yourself. So there is flexibility. Today I'm going to focus on the SQL scripts because that's generally what most people use, but I'm just letting you aware where there's other choices. So these are the scripts that I'll be running. You can see these are all versioned and increasing. And I've got some tables which have got static data in them. Now, if I run my basic demo, which is the main one we saw earlier, just for some clarification, you might see some of the annotations I'm using. I'm also using Project Lombok to get rid of some of the boilerplating for my demonstrations, just in case that's something people have not come across before. But yes, so there's a few annotations, a few things here that so sneaky frozen log and all that are just boilerplate removal. It's nothing really to do with Flyway, but just to make you aware of that, just in case you're wondering. So if I run this, this is the output of the running of my Java application. Be aware, I don't know why, for some reason, when I use the standard Java logger in my IDE, it always comes out as being red. These are not errors, it's all info level. For some reason it shows up as red. I don't particularly know why. So bear that in mind with this demonstration. This is not an error coming out. This is just my IDE being really weird with its coloring. You can see the things that I've ran here. Unfortunately got a bit lost within the output of here, but that's just because of the way I've logged things out. So you can see at the beginning here. Well, so first of all, I will show you that this was the empty database. And if I refresh this, everything that I mentioned before has been created within the databases. If I open up here, you can see all that data that was mentioned in the scripts has been added to the database itself. If I open up the Flyway schema history table, you can see the database representation of that table I showed you before. So you can see that the files been installed, the order they were installed, the versions, just to correspond with that ordering, the descriptions, where the script was in relation to its install path, in relation to the locations path, and what it was installed on and everything else. Installed by will be the user that is connected to the database. In this case, it's SQLite, it's empty, but it's another way that you are able to tell who made these changes, who actually ran this application to make those changes. And so looking back at the logs of the application, you can see the things that I've had. So it starts off with no schema version. That's because this was a fresh database with nothing in there. And then it's put out the number of currently applied migrations. This is before the migration ran. So nothing has been applied to the table, to database. Flyway is gone. This is empty. You can add the number of current pending migrations. This is how many scripts is available. In this case, it was 7. Then I'm executing the scripts. You can see in the logs, again, starting with an empty schema, adding each of the scripts into the database, as well as then showing that they have been successfully applied, as well as some information about where your database is. Ran info again just to get some output, and you can see now that these values have changed. The number of successful applied migrations being 7, and the current number of pending migrations being 0, showing that there's and then my actual Java code, which was just listing out what was in the animals table, has been produced here. So you can see that, yes, deployment happened, application ran, everything is moving as it should do. Yeah. Talk about configurations. Before I'll talk about Spring Boot before talking about different ways that Flyway can be used. So we've got Spring is mostly the biggest integration with Flyway. If you're using Spring Boot as your basis for your application, you'll have integration with Flyway sort of baked in. It comes with telling you have to include Flyway as a dependency, but it's got a very good and very well stabled integration with Flyway to be able to connect to it. Simple things you have to do is say that you're wanting Flyway to be enabled, and in this case I'm just adding the locations. Spring will populate your driver class and your URL into Flyway from its own database, from its own data source configuration. What does that look like? So in this case, I've got a Spring Boot application. Again, this is just a command line one to be simple. I've got a ran here just to be able to run a command line call through Spring to do various arguments. In this case, I'm just trying to, again, list out the animals that I've got in my database and what they'll look like. Since this database is already populated, if I run this now, you will see that this is automatically gone through and just gone, nah, there's nothing I need to do. The applied migrations are 7, pending migrations are 0. And you can see for here from main and from the main run thing, I haven't actually implemented Flyway at all in this situation. Let's say Spring Boot has a good integration with Flyway, and will do that as part of its startup. There are configurations you can use in a bit, which I'll show later, that you can use to modify that approach. But by default, as long as that configuration is set to enabled, that will run. So that is the happy situation. You start deploying with Flyway, it'll update your database as you go along, so your connections have the rights to be able to do so when you deploy your latest version of your source code or of your application to its environment. It's a nice way of being able to keep that management of syncing your environments and also being able to protect your database from any other sort of excess changes. Going back to the image I had before, this, in these scenarios, this would simply just be the service updating your database. But the services example with this, where you've got 2 services running on the same database, there wouldn't be necessarily a conflict or worry that this service would update the database and this service would try and update the database with the same information. If they're both running Flyway, this database would upgrade the migrations into the database, but this service would then read from the database and go, these migrations have already been applied and not need to reapply them. It creates that nice safety between what you're deploying and what actually happens, not being able to duplicate data or duplicate changes. And because you're using a series of standard migration scripts that you can change the deployment area to, I'll show in a bit an example of multiple database releasing with Flyway. You can use the same migration scripts to update each of these environments if necessary. So I'll just get back to where I was. So I was going to talk about now Flyway and branching, because you'll have this. You may have a situation where you've got a small team, or you're working with another developer, or you're working with, you've got other branches you're trying to spin off and do feature branches or whatever in your version control system. But it might be that you've got a shared test database that you're doing things against. Now, if you branched off and that has been a change at a point of your trunk branch, and another developer or yourself, if you suddenly realize you wanted to make a change, that you wanted to park that change and go off and do something else, you could end up including migration scripts in that branch that then get merged back into your main development or your main branch and deployed to your test environment. Your branch you were working on, the old feature branch that you've now returned to, or that is the one you're working on and your teams are working on and everything else, that would be out of date potentially. It wouldn't, if you hadn't merged developing or you hadn't rebased or any of the things that you can do with version control. If it didn't have that thing, but it connects to your test environment, your test database, let's call it, it will notice that there are new scripts being deployed onto that environment that weren't there before. In this case, this is something called future in Flyway. The Flyway identifying that in the way that it operates, there are new changes in the branch's future once it gets merged in. And this isn't always a problem. Sometimes these changes have nothing to do with the environment, the part of the code you're working on, so you don't need to have that update. Sometimes, again, this will just simply be a warning that basically tells you, hey, there are stuff coming, be aware. Once again, if I show on here, I can find to change my branch. So you may notice here that unlike the 7 I had before, I've got 6 here because 1 has fallen behind. If I run my application, I'm on the Spring Boot one, sorry. you can see here that you've got your successful migration 7 because it had 7, and then you have I'm going to use the Maven thing. So Flyway also has a Maven plugin as well. So you can, if you don't want to include it in part of your Java application itself, you can still make it part of your build structure. I'm just going to use this because it gives me a nicer output to show you what I mean. So if I run info, here is the nicer looking table. You can see here that we've got the 6 scripts that we've got plus the repeatable. So the 5 scripts we've got plus the repeatable, and here we've got our future one, our missing one here. And you can run a migration as well, which is why the Spring Boot application works. And again, I'm going to do this with the Maven plugin just so I can show. And you can see here that it all works fine, but it comes out with a warning that your database is newer than the latest version. It hasn't broken, hasn't failed, as you can see from here. See from the fact that it's build success, and that is the same thing in your application that I ran a minute ago, because you don't necessarily need those changes. You don't know. It is a warning so that you as a developer will have to look at and see whether or not you have made the right choice by ignoring this, or you just might have to rebase your branch. But then you make a change. You've made a change. Before you've tried to run Flyway, you've made a change. In this case, this change got made temporarily before, as a version before the one that's missing. In this case, yes, there is still a future one, but Flyway can't apply the new version to the database because it doesn't know if it will come into conflict with the previously deployed script. So it will basically stop you from doing a bad deployment. Again, the things from Flyway is that safety of deployment. If it identifies something wrong that is most likely going to be a problem, it will stop you. The branching one with future is an exception because it's not necessarily going to cause you a problem. Things like this definitely will. Flyway does not know whether or not the changes that you have put in will affect the one that's already gone in, if it was to be done in that order. So it will stop it and ignore it and tell you that it's being ignored and tell you that it's not right. Same thing if you then put one that was afterwards. So you had your future one, but now which you've not updated to, you're not aware of, but you might not maybe not be aware of, you've not updated to. And then you've got your you create a new one, it's a later version for whatever reason. Again, when using timestamp versioning, that makes more sense. You can get conflicts as well if you're doing things like having the same version numbers, but that's pretty obvious. So in this case, we've got a newer version of pending, but since this is now after what Flyway deems being the future, it will put this as being missing and it will stop. It will say categorically, you have missing scripts, but I cannot validate the stability of your database if you do these changes, so I'm going to stop. There's things you can do to override that, but it's normally not good practice. Important things about these are to do with making sure that you don't make changes. And the same thing would happen here if you had 2 versions of 2 scripts which are the same version. You would get effectively the same concept of a merge conflict that you would have in something like Git. So these are things that you're used to when you're using version control for your source code. You're aware that if you make changes to your history in your source control, that you may not be able to push up to your development, your remote repository, sorry, or your just whatever file system you're using to store your source code. And the same thing happens when you're trying to make 2 changes to the same piece of source type of code. If you and another developer change the same piece of code, you'll possibly get merge conflicts. These are things or concepts that we are used to as software developers when using version control, and these things now apply with Flyway to the databases. Matching versions that are different scripts are essentially merge conflicts. Changes to source history that isn't isn't unified across your remote and your local, are missing things. That's equivalent of having to do a force, which you can override by doing repairs, and equivalent of a force push to your source control. But it is stuff to show that warnings of something isn't quite right or hasn't gone right here, and you need to have a look and a think about this. And Flyway is a system that allows you to, well, I mean, it enforces sort of rules in order to stop you from doing stuff like that, or at least making you aware that you're doing stuff like that so that you can make the changes in order to appropriately get your system in a stable and consistent manner. So this is all version control principles, but now applied to your database. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Sorry, I apologize for this. I say I can show, as a demonstration, I can show that idea of ignored as well. See here, this is what I was talking about a moment ago with the future and ignored. If I run this migration, Flyway clearly shows you that it's detected that a migration has not been applied to the database because it's been ignored, because it's not in the right state. And it's stopped you at that point. Whereas the previous one, the future only one, didn't stop you because it might not be an issue. This one has stopped you. And the same thing applies to, I mean, sorry, if I run the, if I run my my Spring demo with this, you can see here, that trace, exception being thrown. There is no way to be able to migrate this into current state. Same thing happens if you had the state, as I mentioned before, the missing state, with the fact that you added a new migration into your database that is newer than the newest one on the service that you don't have, you get this missing error and a pending state. And when you run migrate, you get a very clear validation fail. This does not work. And running Spring Boot application, you once again get, before Spring Boot can launch your set up your scene, you'll get the error come through. Again, it prevents you from deploying and running a bad or incorrect system. So I've talked about what Flyway does, about how it helps you prevent your system, your database and your software being out of sync and being able to deploy bad scripts to your environment. What if you already have a system in place that created your database in the first place? You did use something like Hibernate or JPA to create your initial state, and you want to move on. It's easy to say, oh, you just add Flyway in and work on top. But Flyway does have a certain amount of checks and balances on what's already in the database. It will warn you if you're trying to add Flyway to something that already has data, because it has the concept of, it's the equivalent of trying to add version control to a project that didn't have version control before. Where do you start? Where is your first commit? And Flyway has an art concept baseline. It's basically that creation of that first commit, or at least telling Flyway where it is in its history. So just to show this config, this is just a basic config I have for creating my original, creating an original database using Hibernate to create the original operation script, and then a changeover to using Flyway. What that means is, if I change to my baseline branch, if I remove my database, so I've no longer got a Flyway, I no longer got my Flyway database. I'm just going to go back and commit. You can see here, this is my order generation. My database doesn't have anything in it other than SQLite master. run my application at once. Refresh. And you can see that Hibernate has created my tables. Now I've extracted already the creation script that this would have done for the demonstration purposes. So this is something that is already in my environment. So in my Spring Boot version on this branch, I've got this create script, which will create this state. Now, if I update my configuration, which I've done by changing my branch, I've re-enabled Flyway. I've gotten rid of the Hibernate information, and I've told it to baseline on migration. There is a Flyway baseline command, which will basically do the same thing, but for automation purposes, you can also state the thing that you would baseline on migration. So when you try and approach a migration, if Flyway detects that there's data in your database that isn't Flyway, basically the Flyway has never been run, it will internally run the baseline command automatically in order to bring in a baseline. Or you can do it manually by running Flyway baseline either in your code through the Java or through something like the Maven commands. And I've set a version. So this is my baseline script. This is my version number. You can see within the script header. And I've set the baseline to be that point. And then I've got a secondary script that comes afterwards to do some population. So if I run my demo project now, everything as before runs appropriately. And you can see from the table, let me show you the table. I have been cursed by the demo gods. What is this doing? Do apologize. You know, I've run this demo so many times today, and this has now decided to go, no, I'm not going to read those scripts. Why on earth are you playing like this? Why on earth are you playing? Sorry, I do apologize. Why has this decided to go like this today? Well, I've been cursed with this one. I do apologize. But the long and short of it is what you would see if I wasn't cursed with the demo gods at the moment that this didn't work. The one time I want to show this off, it doesn't work. Is that what it would do is it create an entry in the file. It will create an entry in the schema history table that is specifying that these are the scripts that would have been run to get to this state, and that Flyway has now said, cool, at this point, this is when I started using Flyway. So it has a concept of previous scripts that would have brought us to this step, but didn't actually bring us to this step. So it's that kind of sense of these are the equivalent of the stage I am at, because I've told it that it is, but didn't actually run these scripts. So you can see this one has been ignored because it is the version that is being baseline. So the baseline started at this point. So this was ground zero for Flyway usage, but the scripts I'm specifying here were the scripts that created this database or are the equivalent of what would create this database. So if I trashed my database that I did this on and want to start a new one from fresh, I can run Flyway from this version all the way up on that thing to create exactly the same database I used to have. That way of being able to have that support of knowing how to get from ground zero all the way up to your current stage, but also have that flexibility of if you've already got legacy databases which are already at a step, to be able to say, Flyway, this is where I'm starting from. Can you just migrate everything above this? So most of this I've been doing through Spring because it's easy to demonstrate this has been the integrations. I say I showed at the beginning in the Java doing it natively, but there's other ways of being able to, the Spring one, as much as that integration is great, it has some limitations. For starters, it only runs migrate automatically, it only runs migrate automatically, but you might want to customize that. And this code is the same as what I was saying before with doing it just directly with the Flyway Java modules. You can set a Flyway migration strategy within Spring to be able to customize how Flyway is run when you start up. So in this case, I've basically just replicated what my original Java only environment was running, which is to show the info followed by the migration, followed by another info, just confirm what's gone on within the database. I can show. Which I can show here. Sorry, apologies. You can see from my log output, the Flyway has run, that I am showing off what's been validated in the history tables, what has been run, and then the outputs of my development code. Oh, this is the wrong branch to do it. This is the wrong branch. Why am I having this today? Apologies, my demo environment has decided that it wants to be in a different Git state than it should be. Well, anyway, this is the way you would customize your beans. You can have the flexibility of having the nice integration with Spring Boot, but also having that customization of what you want Flyway to actually do. There's other commands that you might be able to want to run as you do this. You might want the information, you might want the info stage to be in your logs as you run this, but you also might want things like there are different Flyway commands to do with your validation and your integrity of your database, and you might want to run those checks or at least some of that information as well as the migration at the point at which you are executing your demonstration, your distribution. Or you might be in a situation where you want to talk to multiple databases. Spring Boot integration is good in the way that it uses the data source that is configured in Spring, but it only does that once. And the Flyway configuration for Spring will only do that once. But you might have multiple databases that you want to connect this service to, so you are needing to run with different connection details. In this case, you can create a Flyway service that has multiple versions of Flyway. You can do this anywhere where you want. You can get Spring Boot to stop running Flyway automatically and just natively integrate it with your Spring beans. You can either create beans or you can create services. It depends on what you want to do. So in this case, I've just created a service which will run migrate twice. And so this will start up at load up time when it is initiated. And these will run and create two different databases. And that's because it already exists. I am getting cursed today. I do apologize. Let's connect. Database. I haven't got configuration, have I? False, yeah. I do apologize. You know, you run this demo, or you don't run the demo and test everything out, everything works fine, and you show it in front of people, and it decides, no, I do not want to do this today.
Why is
This is-
Flyway enabled set to false? I don't know. Is that
That
on the
is
screen?
because, so this specifically in this example, I'm manually creating my Flyway instances to run within Spring. The configuration, which is why I was making sure this is set to false, this is the default one that is built into Spring. So when Spring Boot starts up, it looks to see whether or not Flyway is on the class path, and if enabled is set to true, or I think it defaults to true anyway, but if it's set to true, it will start executing a instance of Flyway at startup. In this instance, I don't want that because I want control over all the instances of Flyway that I'm running. So I've set this to false so the automatic one doesn't run. Instead, it should be running these two here, but for some reason, it's starting up a database. It's starting up an instance of my database that is not empty, and therefore it's causing an error. And I don't know why that's now deciding to do that. That's usually when Hibernate or something like that has decided to create the database schema on the fly. But this is now empty, and it should be running. It should be running fine. What I can do is quickly. Sorry, this is a bit of a. I'm going to quickly run to get a version set up. So that's my database thing. Just to show the duplication thing. So if I run this now, cool. I've run this now against a database that was already set up, but also creating a duplicate one as well. So if I open up a new data source and point it at this duplicate database, you can see that it's created the same thing as my original one. So you can see this is now two databases, exactly the same, created by the Flyway scripts.
Right. Got to mean in a backup.
Yeah, it could be a backup. You could also, so this is a scenario where, yes, it could be the backups. It could be you want to make sure that you've got two databases. Like if you've got your, say you're using like Hibernate Audit, for example, and you want those separately, you might need to have separate sort of connection details with those, or you do have two different backup databases, but their structure is not automatically updated by like copying the data over from one database to another. It's more like select statements that transfer one to another. You need to make sure that backup database is the same structure as your original one. So you might want to use Flyway. You might want to use Flyway on the same scripts to do both of that. It could also be that those databases are completely separate. Now, in the case of this example, I'm using the same migration script for both of these, but these locations don't have to be the same. You could have one database that's got, say, it's a shop service. You've got an online shop service. You've got one database which has got all your online merchants and offers and things like that, and products details, but your customer information has to be separated on a separate service. But you've got one service that runs against both of them, or runs the whole system. You can have two instances of Flyway that points to both of those databases, and even different folders in your jar or in your product structure that will then update those. As soon as that service starts up, it will update both those databases with the appropriate scripts for those databases. In my example, I'm using the same scripts just because it's easier for me to manage for the demonstration, or should be if I wasn't being hit with errors today. Do apologize. But in a more real world situation, what you're actually looking at probably there is a service which is connecting to database A and database B for whatever reasons. but also it's needing to keep those databases up to date with itself. So it has all the models that are connected to all of it, but the databases are separate. So you have instance of Flyway A and instance of Flyway B, which is pointing to different folders or different resources in your jar with scripts that update those particular databases. So you can have one service which maintains all your databases, as well being able to specify different Flyway instances to run, do those migrations, and then move on. And finally, moving on from that, I wanted to quickly just show the point that I got to at the beginning when I was showing about you had a major modification to your database. You suddenly had a change from a static piece of text information in a table to being able to this now being part of a new table, a new configuration. You've got to do that data management. Now, with a lot of the things I've talked about before, with Hibernate and things like that, creating those tables is easy enough. The scripts can be done, and that's fine enough. But the transformation and the implementation, you usually end up writing your own scripts. And simple import scripts are not normally the appropriate way of doing that, because they're meant to be for importing data. Now, with Flyway, I do apologize, some of these I'm not showing you Flyway in the best light. I hope you can bear with me on that. So I'm going to run this to create my original schema again, just so I'm starting with the blank slate. So I've got my animal table here that I've shown before, which has got classifications and IDs, types, and classifications. Now I'm going to move into a new table. So this is the change I was showing in my slides earlier, where I'm changing from a what was a string into a many-to-one relationship, and I need to be able to update the database accordingly. So in this environment, I've now got an additional script. And this is where some things that you can do with complications with Flyway that you may not necessarily be able to do with simple import files in the tools that you have available more natively with Java. And this is the whole thing about being able to run more complicated things. You can run this as a stored procedure. You can run this as the script I've got here. You can do all sorts of manipulation within this in order to get your database to be in the state you are. So if I run this, it's updated the database. And as I say, my application has now run properly, despite the fact that I made the code changes before I deployed I made the code changes before the database was updated. So when the application launched, Flyway, by being launched and set up by Spring, was able to update the databases before the application started running against that database. So I'm going to refresh this. I've got my animals table still, but now there's no classification field. It's now classification ID, and that points to the new classification table. This is, if you try to do this with Hibernate updates, for example, the problem you would find is that it wouldn't remove the old information. It would only create the new, and you would have to run specific scripts to do the transformation in a way that isn't supported per se by the software. So you're expected to have schema and import files with say for Hibernate and JPA's way of being able to do this, but those are meant to be for like static creating of the schema environment itself and importing static data. It's not meant to be for manipulating existing data into a form. But migration script and Flyway are so effectively, and they are there to be able to create and manipulate and create things that you need within your database as part of that version control. So you can do the things that you need to do with your environment. I just realized what the time is. Just realized what the time is, so I think I'll be wrapping up my presentation there. I'm hoping this has given you a taster of what Flyway can offer and what is available to you. There's plenty more to invest, plenty more to look into with Flyway that I hope you will do. A lot of the information can be found on the Flyway website, as well as tutorials by various other people within the Flyway community. There's some very good ones on Beldon, which are normally my go-to place to go for anything that I don't understand, as well as on the Redgate websites as well. I hope you enjoyed this taster presentation of what Flyway can offer and how you can manipulate your database and your system to work together in ways that are being able to be deployed to any environment without having to have that distance between your code commitments and your database changes. Thank you very much. I will, yes, if there's any questions or anything else that you want to be go in more detail, please feel free to ask or put into the chat. Thank you very much.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions here for Barry before we end the presentation? Okay, well, thank you, Barry, for a great presentation. Usually what would happen if we were meeting in person, we'd have kind of a round of applause. So I'll give you mine on this side. Oh, looks like we've got one.
Cool.
How does Flyway compare to Liquibase?
I can't talk more about that per se. I will give two reasons why. One, okay, my main reason for not really wanting to talk about Liquibase is I used to use Liquibase years ago and had a really bad time with it, and my opinion is kind of marred by that. It was a while ago, so it might have improved. The main differences between Flyway conceptually and Liquibase is Liquibase leans more heavy on its own DSL language, uses an XML structure to be able to create its change scripts. Now you can create those XML scripts and just have your SQL script inside, but they try and encourage you to use their XML script, which means that when you're talking about your environment, you're going to need to know Java. You're going to have to probably know your SQL anyway in order to know what manipulations you want in your database in the first place, and then you're going to have to learn their XML language on top. In addition to that, the way that they link releases is a lot more complicated than what Flyway does. Flyway is great in regards to that it takes a very simple approach to how this works in a more native array without having to overload it with extra bits of information about the construction of the scripts themselves. I've also more recently been looking into Liquibase's way of being able to handle onboarding from later points, and a lot of that takes manipulation of a history to be able to represent that, and that's something that doesn't sit well with me. I've had this conversation quite recently, actually, as we've been discussing Flyway in other terms, that the history should be truly representative of what happened. So if you are onboarding onto Flyway or Liquibase or whatever you want to do this sort of database migration, maintenance, management, it should represent what actually happened. Now, with Flyway, we're trying to show with the baselining of, it will show you what the equivalent stages would have been to get to where you are, but it's very clear that that wasn't what happened to this database because it was already at this state. Now, with Liquibase, if you do the same thing, you actually end up creating a false history, which doesn't sit well with me. So there's things like that. I'd say I have not had good experience with Liquibase. I'm not saying it's not a good product because I don't know, because my own experience is being poor. But in regards to the core principles, they're saying that they do things in very different ways, where Liquibase leans more heavily on its own infrastructure to do it, like I said, the XML, the more manual approach to changing and getting on board with the change logs, while Flyway is more down the basics of, this is your SQL script, this is where your history is, and this is the proper, this is meant to be the actual representation of what it does. Apart from that, they do have similarities, but yeah, it's more the nuts and bolts of how they do things differently. But I say I've got bad experience with liquid based, so I can't go much into it, unfortunately. Sorry. Looking at the next question, how good is Flyway tooling help for migrating between databases? Unfortunately, that's one of the places where Flyway isn't particularly great. It doesn't make any changes between the SQL that you are using on one database to another. So the scripts have to be written in the SQL language of the database you're going to. So if they're shared SQL languages, if you're using, T-SQL basic, then you can switch between one and the other pretty easily. But if you're going from very complicated, very specific, like from something that's Oracle specific to something that's SQL Server specific, then you're going to have problems with those migrations. Going back to LibFace, that's something that sort of their XML system can overcome if you can get into the way of doing things on that. Say, Flyway is meant to be very back to basics of it is written in the native language of your environment. You could also do this with, with the in Flyway you could overcome some of this with using Java migrations rather than SQL migrations, and the same thing with our script migrations as well, because those can be written in a bit more agnostic way. They're not tied necessarily to SQL, they're tied to like JPA and things like that, which can be a bit more language agnostic. But yeah, Flyway specifically is more to do with migrations between databases of a similar type, not necessarily between different database types. The next one, are most organizations expected to use something like Flyway? In my experience, I've seen more often than not. Before I started working at Redgate on working on Flyway full time, I'd been a Flyway user for various different companies for about 7 years beforehand. Every single one had come to Flyway specific through their own means. Either they've been introduced it by someone outside the company or someone brought it in from another project. And the companies I've been working for at those time had been very interested in it because it gives both a safety net when you're trying to deploy. It stops anything, any bad migrations going out, but any bad database changes that don't fit your models properly. But also it gives a level of identifying points of failure as well. When a change was made because you can look at the logs. So there's certain thing that from those that organizations like. There's also, if you're talking about corporate organizations and enterprise, there are higher levels of Flyway that I haven't talked about here because I wanted to focus on the open source editions of Flyway, but stuff that also helps organizations make more sense over their migrations, reporting, comparisons, things like that, which make people, hopefully should make those companies feel a bit more comfortable. But yeah, it's one of those things of, I've seen a lot of companies use it. More companies I've seen when talking to friends and colleagues and going to conferences, most companies I've known use something like Flyway, mostly Flyway for using Spring Boot because historically it's been very tied together, but also things like LibFace and a few other ones which are now coming into existence. So yeah, most expected. Expecting is a hard thing to answer. Are a lot using it? Yeah, from my observations, yes. And from working with Redgate and Flyway, the amount of community and enterprise input we get from customers is enough to say, yes, there is definitely a adoption out there by organizations, more widespread, especially when they are doing distributed systems themselves and they're not necessarily hosting on their own systems. I think that's the last question I can see in the chat.
Okay, yeah, I think the last one was just a comment from Jake. He had the experience that ISO standard SQL gets you 90% of the way there, but it's that last 10% that gets you.
Yes, yeah, there are sometimes very specific things in SQL scripts that can trip you up. I had that when trying to port this over to a MySQL, an SQLite product earlier when this was originally done on a MySQL server, and little trips up with little differences between they can be a point. So there's certain languages out there that are very much more different. So I'd always point at Oracle as being the one that's got the most complications, especially when you're talking about some of the additional stuff like SQL Plus and that certain editions of Flyway can include. It can make things very confusing. But yes, so if you're using basic T-SQL, then you have got that flexibility. But you're right, it's that extra 10% that gets you the rest of the way.
All right, so if there's no more questions or anything, then thank you again for a great presentation, and I'll go ahead and then end the recording here.
Thank you very much.